Welcome to this webinar on strengthening team-based care that will be led by Dr. Sarah Singer. My name is Gina Lima, Program Manager for the CHCF Alumni Network. For those of you not familiar with the network, it is comprised of more than 500 clinician leaders with a mission to improve and health in California by facilitating learning, collaboration across healthcare sectors, collective action, and continued professional and personal development of network members. The network is funded by the California Healthcare Foundation and administered by the Health First Center at UCSF. And thank you to Dr. Ann Lindsay, who is an alum and chair of the High Needs, High Cost Care Interest Group, for initiating this webinar. We're so pleased to have Dr. Singer presenting today. She's a professor of medicine at Stanford University. Her research in the field of healthcare management and policy focuses on how organizational leadership and culture impact efforts to implement health delivery innovations, integrate patient care, and improve safety and reliability of healthcare organizations. Some logistics: everybody should be on mute, but please feel free to unmute yourselves to ask questions at any time, or go ahead and throw your questions into the chat function. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the website afterwards. Without further ado, thank you, Dr. Singer, for being here, and I'll hand it off to you.
Great, thank you, and thank you for that introduction. I am delighted to be together with you this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to what I hope will be a conversation. So I've set up my presentation. You'll see I am not in presenter mode because I'm actually hoping that I can take some notes based on feedback from the group. So I'm treating you more like I would a class session in a course that I teach, because I think that you will likely have as much or more to teach me and to teach each other as I will in speaking myself. So you'll get a sense of that as we go, but I'll stop along the way and I'll invite your participation, and I hope you take me up on the offer. You're also welcome to ask questions as we go. See if I can get that to go. So just a little bit about what I am hoping to do today. The topic is on team-based care during the period of COVID. Or, now I guess we're going through lots of challenges, but my focus has been primarily on how different COVID has made everything seem. So I want to first distinguish what makes team-based care during the COVID pandemic unique, and acknowledge the challenges that this presents for making teams work effectively. And we'll talk through some levers for overcoming those issues and making great teams. And that in particular, well, all of it, I think, is where I'll ask for your input, but I'm hoping that you can help us identify additional levers in particular. I'm going to start with basics on, what is a team. We're going to try to level set a little bit to focus ourselves on what people have said in the literature on teamwork. So this comes from Richard Hackman, who is, the man when it comes to research on teams and teamwork. And he defines teams very specifically as a bounded and stable set of individuals interdependently working for a common purpose. I'm going to unpack that for just a minute. By bounded, what is meant is who's in and who's not on the team. So that's a pretty high bar, especially when you think about healthcare teams, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. Second criterion or distinguishing characteristic of a team is its stability. So the work occurs for people on the team together over time. That's also a pretty high bar given where we are today. They work interdependently. So your work can't be done as an individual or groups of individuals. And this is one of the key challenges that people face all the time. A lot of people throw teams together to work on tasks that don't require interdependence, and that actually tends to backfire and make people work less effectively together. So it's really important that people see the work that you're doing as requiring interdependence. Now in healthcare, interdependence is very often required, and so we need teamwork in healthcare. And the last aspect of this definition is that the goals be shared so that there's a common purpose for the team. And so very often with these traditional models of teamwork, we think of teams like this. You might also think of athletic teams, but the team is stable. It's got a bounded group of individuals who are independently working together to achieve a shared goal. So again, kind of collectively a pretty high bar. More recently, there's been acknowledgement in the world that I come from, where people think about how teams work, that that actually, if you look at what's the landscape out there, that there are all different kinds of teams and team requirements, different ways of working together in this interconnected and fast-paced world, many of which are relevant now. So one paper by some colleagues and mentees of mine have distinguished these different dimensions of team dynamism and the ways in which they're very different from that traditional model of thinking about teams. So on the left-hand side, various team structures are changing rapidly. So membership is shifting fairly regularly. The goals and the tasks are changing pretty regularly. The duration is getting much more compressed. So we're asking teams to do more and more quickly. And the way that people on the teams are interacting needs to be a lot more flexible. We're not sitting around the table like you saw in that picture anymore, certainly not today. And the right-hand column talks about differences among team members. So we don't have teams that where the individuals anymore look or think alike at all. In fact, we don't desire that because of the contributions that individual disciplines and ways of thinking can contribute to teams. So lots of individual differences that we need to cope with in terms of people's expertise, their demographics, their social networks, which again can be very good, but also make it difficult for teaming. Situational differences, so now we are dispersed across sites, different organizational affiliations, system affiliations, all of which make teamwork more difficult. So more definitions of teams have tried to take that into account. Instead of bounded and stable teams, we just talk about groups of individuals who interact with a common, with a purpose to pursue a common goal. So here again, not necessarily bounded or stable, just groups of individuals who need to come together, but they're still doing interdependent work and they're still working together toward common goals. So trying to bring us forward in terms of how we're thinking about teams, and yet COVID kind of shook up the landscape again. So we're acting really differently in teams. We've got down on the right, people working on, working from home and on computers, trying to talk to people, where you can't really see them because they've got masks on and they're behind lots of protective gear. They're distancing themselves, even if they can come together, as in the top left-hand corner box, and often kind of physically moving around. These are some of the pictures that I could grab from the internet. We see all sorts of different kinds of conditions that people are having to work under now that we hadn't had to grapple with even in those different sorts of teams that we were taking into consideration up until now. So I wanted to, this is the first place I'm going to ask you to unpack this a little bit with me. So there are all kinds of ways in which what we're dealing with now in terms of our teams are different because of COVID. So clearly high stress, we've had stress before, but like really high stress, limitations on the resources, staff who get sick or aren't available or have childcare responsibilities or other family responsibilities or are afraid to come in, and that changing constantly, inventory, real resource constraints that we haven't as a first world country have to face in a long, long time. Great uncertainty in terms of how, what is this disease and how to cope with it, how to prevent it. Personnel redeployments going on, both within the organization and across organizations. So people traveling from, the Bay Area to New York to pitch in and to try and help, how that shakes up our ability to work on teams. We are asking people to do things at the boundaries of their training. So we are bringing surgeons in and throwing them on the front lines and asking them to triage people. We clearly have an unprecedented context with people sheltering in place. So I have a bunch of bullet points, and I'm just going to breathe for a moment and see what's missing here. What's different about the kinds of teams that you are participating in or observing in this crazy time. And just as a reminder, you'll have to unmute yourself to speak. And if you want, you can write.
Hi,
yeah,
this is Mike Whitty from CPCA. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for doing this. I think that one of the things that I'm seeing or we're seeing in our safety net organizations is, I'll start out by saying the blurring of lines. I think that it's, you mentioned it in terms of redeployment, but that also, an example would be that we can now bill for um, LCSWs and NFTs, which we couldn't do previously. That is, they were not billable under FQHC licenses. So that looking at the safety net, the way that, and these are behavioral health examples, but where some of the compensation for the care is shifting to what were previously unbillable visits or encounters. So I think that the
Yes.
opportunity in that is that we're looking at kind of new ways of conceiving the value, literally value in terms of billable people on the team, and we're hoping that this will actually be an entree into value-based care.
Yeah, wonderful.
So,
And from a teamwork perspective, it's complicated because you have to monitor who you can bill for what sorts of things in order to figure out how to compose these new teams. Great, thank you.
right.
Any
Sure.
other big things that are missing?
This is Dominique. The thing that's really striking to me is that in March, when people kind of woke up to that this was really a problem, there was an acute need to get respiratory clinics up. And so people are in the acute phase and all hands on deck. There's somewhat of a tendency of you just need to do it and have somebody who's directing it. You'll figure out some of the details later. And that's great. It's what you need then. However, this is really a marathon. So it's both has the aspects of what you do in acute settings and an acute, catastrophe. When there's a earthquake, you have power of command certain ways. You have certain types of communication. When it's chronic care, you need a different approach. And so we really have a mix right now with this pandemic. And we had to really kind of gently pull people back in the acute phase. Like, yes, we had to get the clinics going, but pull back because you need to have the energy for the marathon, and we knew it would be. And we're now switching back. I can already see the wave turning at the moment. So I can see that dynamic, they're different team dynamics playing here between the acute and the chronic.
That's really exciting. So is Matthew, is he well?
Absolutely. So I am, I appreciate these comments. So we're in totally new spaces in some cases. We need to deal with the acute crisis situation and at the same time think ahead to what we have to do to manage, manage in an ongoing phase, at the same time as looking ahead to the potential for needing to revert back to the acute phase and not knowing exactly where we are when. I mean, it is really kind of a new way of dealing with teams. So I wanted to thank you for that. I wanted to highlight it so we all kind of just appreciate how new and how different this is, because it's hard to figure out how to make good teams and make teams effective in that sort of situation. So the bulk of what I want to spend our time today on is talking about how teams can be effective under these kinds of conditions, which arguably we're still learning about and trying to understand how to describe. Take a brief diversion to just bring us to another definition, which is about what's an effective team. So we talked about what a team was, just to be on the same page here. So again, reverting back to Richard Hackman, but I think this one still sticks. We can talk about 3 different ways in which teams can be considered to be effective. And I think in thinking through what we need to do to make effective teams, I think we want to pursue all 3 of these outcomes. So the first is just the classic kind of, we want to produce the output that's useful to and valued by the team's client. Or clients. So in this case, the team client is our patients, it is our organizations, etc. But we also, at the same time, I think we want to become increasingly more competent as a team. So here's a team outcome, making the team a better team as we go along, despite the fact that we don't necessarily have bounded membership. And we also want to foster team members' personal learning and growth. So the the individual members of the team, we want to continue to enable them to grow personally. So a outcome of the team, an outcome that is kind of an outcome of the output of the team, an outcome that is team specific, and an outcome that is individual specific. And I think we want to think about all three of those. So what makes effective teams? There are, and I keep going back to the literature. I'm going to do that at the same time as trying to build forward. But to start, there are key levers for making teams effective under normal conditions that we can think about. And then I'm gonna, and this is drawing on the paper that I wrote with one of my students, Michaela Carasy, that I'll turn to next. But the literature speaks to the importance of structuring, launching, facilitating, sustaining, and improving, and leading. And these are, just ways of categorizing our way of thinking about these things. But in looking to the literature, when we think about how to make teams effective, structuring of that team comes up a lot. So they talk about the need to select team members, having the right skills, the right size, and having enough functional and cultural diversity so that you get everything that team needs in the members of the team. So structuring the team and what the team does is critically important. Launching the team is a critically important moment in teams. And there the literature talks about beginning to build familiarity and trust among the members and establishing group norms and processes. This launch can really set the tone for how the team does going forward, but it also, kind of in thinking about traditional teams, envisions a longer term horizon than some of our teams under these COVID situations have the luxury of. Now, the third area is around facilitating. So when you are facilitating teamwork, you're thinking about managing a set of processes designed to facilitate teamwork, and including, I couldn't decide how to write that up, sorry for that. So including decision-making, conflict management sorts of processes. So part of what you want to do when you're structuring teams is thinking about those processes and designing processes that are more likely to lead to the best outcomes for those teams. And then even as the team is operating, you want to think about what you need to do to sustain and improve that team. So you're thinking about engaging the stakeholders that you need to have support the team on an ongoing basis, and especially creating learning processes and a learning environment that make people feel psychologically safe and able to work together. And then the last bucket, which wasn't included in the article that I authored, but obviously comes up in lots of other articles, and I think was underpinning what we were thinking about, and I wanted to spend some time talking about it today, is this leadership piece. So typically what the literature says for teams is that leading a team requires focusing on doing all of these other things right, and that if you do all of these other things right, that you will have created a culture for sustaining effective teamwork. So I'm going to contrast that to a theme that Dominique described, which is that when you've got this acute situation, you've got to do some very rapid decision making, which requires a different form of leadership. So I'm going to turn to that as well. So here's just context for what it is the literature says makes teams effective generally. So I'm going to use that to just unpack, in the case of our COVID teams or teams in conditions of COVID, and hope to unpack this a little bit with you all. So with respect to structuring, and each of these cases, we can think about what predictable things are going to come up. So I call them predictable issues, and then thinking more deeply about what the literature from teams, and I also draw on the high reliability literature to think about what some potential countermeasures might be. So with respect to structuring, where it's really important to get the right people at the right time and with the right diversity and backgrounds in order to do the work, instead we've got a real lack of clarity about who's on the team, who's in charge of the team, who's responsible for what on the team. Very often, a lot of what we do in the launch and preparatory to the launch is defining roles and responsibilities and making sure we know who it is. Here we don't really have that luxury. So we look to the literature and identify countermeasures like thinking about what it is we can do to create team-like structures. So the suggestions that we had offered were looking to maybe having a core team, maybe a doctor and a nurse who can lend some stability, even if other members of the team are changing all the time, or it could be one person, but someone who has a little bit of continuity in order to integrate and to coordinate other members as they come and go across shifts or across calls or various rotations. Another one is around creating common processes. So even if individuals have to move to different teams, if these are processes that are common across all teams, things like huddles, we've been doing huddles for a while, but things like that tend to make it easier for people to move and to join into different teams. So stop there for a minute. Again, in your experience now, structuring teams, have you identified things that you would recommend?
This is Ann Lindsay, and I think it's really important for the leaders of the team to empower all the team members to contribute to problem solving regardless of their credential. And that's kind of on the lean, the Toyota model of you really go down to the production line. So if it's that, it's not a matter of telling people what to do, but it's empowering them to help figure it out.
Absolutely, thank you. And yes, I will talk about what the literature talks about as deference to expertise, which is very much along these lines. In another slide, a slide or so. I'm wondering if you're thinking about particular ways of structuring the team that would empower them. So maybe things like designating responsibilities up front so that people, or designating certain resources to team members so that they have that empowerment as they go forward might accommodate your suggestion there. So great idea, good. I'll move on to launching, which is where the deference to expertise comes up. So a number of predictable issues that come up around the launch, lacking the familiarity and trust that you like to try to build at the beginning from that launch, but you don't really have the time when you're throwing people together like this and changing them up as flexibly as we are today, and not having time to get to know each other again, and these interpersonal barriers like the face masks and the gowns, which have been so prevalent in the way we're working together today, because it's the only way we can get near each other. So lots of predictable issues. We looked at the literature and there were some ideas. So with respect to building familiarity and trust, you can do, the literature suggests ways of doing really fast launches. So a structured approach to, and letting people know that, this is about a 3-minute launch. This is not a lot of things, but each person tell us what you bring, what you do, what you bring, and what you need in order to be successful on this team. You can do it really quickly in order to allow people to know each other and to recognize what the expertise of each other's is critically important. The not getting enough time to know each other, similarly, but people in the literature talk about building swift trust, so quickly building that trust and one way of doing it is to have, especially the leader, acknowledge the value of the diversity of the expertise that people bring, especially if you've got someone who is coming from a context that is unusual for this work. You have a surgeon coming to a frontline team, you can acknowledge the value of the expertise that surgeon brings, even though obviously it's not necessarily the expertise that's immediately needed for this particular work. But by doing that, you help to build each of the other members' trust in what that team member brings. And the same is true of people who have who have non-clinical expertise, or who are typically viewed as with sort of less levels of credential on the team. So critically important role of the leader to do that. And then, as Anne was talking about, this encouraging deference to expertise where it's warranted, because the people on the front lines are seeing that. And in order to appropriately defer to people's expertise, you need to empower them to both call the shots and to back them up when they are making recommendations for what to do differently. This face mask issue, we've seen, wonderful ways of personalizing people's interaction, despite the fact that they aren't seeing each other. So making sure that people can call each other by first names, using, plastering people's with their personal photographs, putting their roles on their badges so people can see that really quickly. So a whole bunch of different ways people have tried to do that. Just stop for a minute and see if anybody has other suggestions for what you do instead of this launch where you have to act really quickly. I see a suggestion from Yusuf, who talks about the daily team huddle or launch for remote teleworking teams. Oh, wonderful, right. So you can do this launch, you can do these huddles remotely, absolutely, and it can be quick. It gives people a chance to see each other more, even if they're not in the same room, as they would often be if they were together. And they can do that with the masks off. So that's actually a wonderful suggestion. Thank you, Yusuf. And I should encourage you, if you would rather use the chat, I'm looking at it, so you're welcome to do that. I think, what we're seeing is a lot of creativity in how people are thinking about how to build familiarity, build trust, enable people to get to know each other and to know what the benefits that individuals bring to the work. That's the critically important you want everybody to like each other on the team. That's important too. But the familiarity and the trust that is required to enable teams to work effectively together so that we can draw on each other's expertise and gain the benefit of working independently together in order to accomplish what the team needs to do. So these are creative solutions, and the idea here, I think, is to know what needs to happen and to continue to think creatively about how to do it. So facilitating was the next bucket of ideas, and some of the predictable problems with respect to facilitating. What we're trying to do is to make these processes work, but there's a hesitancy when you can't see each other or when you're working remotely. You've got new people on the team and they're moving around all the time. A real hesitancy to ask questions or admit mistakes, and miscommunications across different areas of expertise because people don't know the same language. So it's the same, we're trying to create the same sort of environments that we're creating on our teams generally. We need that psychological safety. We need the processes, and then we're just looking for different innovative ways of doing that. So important things to maintain focus on is training group members around situational awareness, so they are observant of what other people are doing to the best of their ability, even if they can't always see. So being careful about picking up on people's cues. Using humble inquiry, an incredibly important tool, especially when you can't necessarily pick up on those cues, to be able to ask questions in a humble way. Both of those critically essential for doing joint problem solving together. And then you need sort of leaders who help leaders foster the inclusion and the ability for people to speak up so that they are able to call attention to concerns, problems, and work together. So asking people like, do you have ideas or suggestions? Given your perspective is different from mine, we really need to hear from you too. Kinds of scripts that will enable people who aren't used to needing to quickly create those psychologically safe spaces to do so. So I think Charlene made a comment. Oh, she has to leave early. Bye, Charlene. Thank you very much. I thought she was offering a suggestion. I'd welcome, if there are techniques that you all have used to create this safe space and to make processes work to facilitate this in your organizations, I'd love for you to share. Or have ideas.
Morning. Yeah.
Connie, is that you? Did you have a suggestion for us?
I'm sorry,
Maybe we're
that's
just
a
hearing
mistake.
Okay, no problem. So I lay out a few. Take a pause for a minute and see if others have.
This is Ann Lindsay
Ann?
again, but a couple of years ago, we had at our CHCF alumni meeting, we had a session on leadership, and I really felt the important question that needs to be asked of team members are you able to maximize your contribution? You know, and if not, why not? You know, that's another way of making everybody able to contribute as much as they can.
Oh, I love that. So that's a wonderful script to have, because it's asking people to say, how can I be a more effective team member? Thank you. You can make additional suggestions as we go. I mentioned humble inquiry, and I suggested that it was important. So I thought it would be worth spending just a little bit of an aside to talk a little bit more about that, because it is such a key to facilitating teamwork. So it comes from Ed Shine's and his building on various other people's, but the way he describes humble inquiry is the fine art of drawing someone out, of asking questions to which you don't already know the answer, or at least allowing for the potential that you don't know the answer, of building relationship based on curiosity and interest in the other person. So what you're trying to do with humble inquiry is to create good relationships that enable for strong communication and that allow you to successfully accomplish your task. So humble inquiry is easy to describe, much harder to do. And if you were in my class, I would at this moment break you up into pairs and have you do it with each other. But in your groups, I would encourage you to do this. So the art of humble inquiry is about doing much less telling and doing a lot more asking, and doing a better job of listening intently and acknowledging what you're hearing from the other person who you are asking of. And I think the real key about this humble inquiry is to remember that being humble means granting to someone else higher status than you have for yourself, even if your kind of rank in hierarchy does not lend to that. So one way of easing people into that is allowing them to suggest that maybe you can grant someone a higher status than you claim for yourself in this moment. Or you can acknowledge the possibility that because of somebody else's perspective, maybe you are working with someone on the front lines who happens to speak the language of a patient and you don't have it. There are all sorts of reasons why someone else might have a higher status or higher claim to authority in the moment, that will enable you, if you recognize, to more humbly ask the questions, but really inquiring as if there is something to be learned. And it is, as I say, really easy to say and much harder to do in practice, and a skill that I recommend strongly, and one in which I recommend instilling fairly regularly in these teams that you're trying to promote a psychologically safe space from or among, and trying to promote the ability to draw on people's different expertise and wisdom. So more on facilitating, there's a lot more that people can do. So one area of predictable concern is that people are shifting and doing so in a really time-pressured environment where there's lots of interruptions, and the ability to hand over information between patients is challenged. So establishing processes for doing it, or relying on agreeing to processes, we have a lot of these processes in hand, and scripting that for people so that it's something that we can do. We're looking for ways of doing these things much more efficiently and much more reliably over time. new problems are arising. So we're in a new context, and we need to acknowledge it. And one of the important things for leaders to do in this context is to ensure that frontline staff can bypass any established protocols if the kind of novelty of the situation demands it. And then another predictable problem is this added stress can really lead to all sorts of things, but conflict in particular. So one of the roles that leaders can play in mitigating that conflict is to kind of emphasize shared goals, establish a cadence so everybody knows what to expect, and it's easier for people to say, okay, I got to do this now, and I know what's coming. It tends to ease the tension there. And then showing appreciation and compassion for people, recognizing that we're all dealing with these challenges. So we've seen, and this just comes from the news, really, people sharing wonderful inspirational quotes at huddles, nominating their heroes, singing songs together, all kinds of wonderful things. So I'll pause again and see if anybody has suggestions here. What have you seen? What have you read? Either one. Scripts for handoffs or? Well, I remember reading about one where they were seeing a video of one where they were singing Amazing Grace in the huddle. I also think, people outside of institutions are doing wonderful things to try to acknowledge people. And I think that type of intervention is one that helps sustain people in these moments, gives people appreciation of each other. Someone wrote in the chat, Melissa, thank you. I saw team sharing good news. Yeah, so building that into the huddles. Tell us some good news today can just help take off some of the steam when you're feeling that crisis. Alex has another one, workflows that team members edit collectively at team meetings, and encouraging shout out sharing of good news either via email or in meetings. Absolutely, encouraging shout outs makes a ton of sense. So tell me, Alex, if you can unmute yourself, I'm not sure if you have the opportunity. Tell us what workflows that team members edit collectively at team meetings.
Yeah,
are you thinking about that one around this middle bullet, the ensuring the bypassing protocols? You're talking about revising them?
Yeah, so we're functional a little differently. We're not doing direct patient care, but we have workflows on how to address more of the social and physical needs of folks who are out with COVID-19. So we have workflows that intersect with a number of different departments throughout the organization. And so team members make calls to folks who are out with COVID-19 throughout the week, and based on what they learn, we edit those workflows collectively at our team meetings. Oh, great. And on a regular basis. Yep, correct. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, right? Like week to week, we are learning so much new stuff. Mm-hmm. So I'm adding that.
Sarah, this is Alan Glassrock. The one thing I haven't heard yet, the notion of it that we're sort of in a culture where anybody can stop the assembly line, to use another lean metaphor, from Toyota, because what we're going to find in a free flow situation is not only that there are better ways to do things, but mistakes happen. And a way to deal with that without fear is utterly critical to solving the problems. And especially in hospital care isn't built on that model by and large, even though we're trying to credit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any thoughts about that?
Well, so it's interesting, right? We thought about that when we were writing our paper, and one of the reasons that we didn't include it is because we feel more like we're in a situation where the line can't be stopped. in many of, in many of the situations that people are finding themselves in. It's a crisis and things just need to keep moving, at least in parts of what we're envisioning. I think we're in different phases of this crisis where it's less time pressured, less acute, where you do have the opportunity. I think that's absolutely critical. We were thinking more in that immediate time frame.
It goes to the revising protocols. That you wouldn't stop work, but you would deal with it the next morning right away, for instance,
Absolutely.
if you had a huddle. And it's
no,
just the permission to say we need to do that doesn't only live with the leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to enable that for each other. Thank you. Okay,
We also found turning the meeting, letting the front line lead the meeting and having the leaders sort of sit in the background was a way to empower people. And that could certainly happen with morning huddles.
Yeah, okay.
Have a nurse lead it or a nursing assistant lead it or whoever it is.
Great.
Sarah,
I'm not
this
sure
is
that
Mike
goes
Whitty. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. That one of the things that I'm impressed. I love the language of establishing cadence, because it feels like it's it feels like dancing, that you're actually developing some kind of a rhythm with each other, all of you. That is something that everyone contributes to, and has a importantly and necessarily equal may not be the right word, but equitable role in. And I think that it also speaks to being able to empower the folks that are in that organization or in that team. I think that's really beautiful. And go ahead.
I was going to say it's a wonderful thing to observe too. I hope people have seen it in their organizations. I mean, at the outset there was just pandemonium, really. People trying to figure out what to do, and then we started to see cadence emerge. And I think at different levels. So institutionally at the organization, patterns of communication, patterns of interaction, and that patterning became I think much more important now than I've seen it, previously. So I think you're right. I love the description of it as a rhythm and a dance. And I think each team creates their own, and you experience it at multiple different levels, not only within your team, but through the organization, and having something that feels like an expectation. So you know what somebody else is going to do around you can be incredibly helpful for lowering the stress. Yeah. Thank you, Mike.
Great. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. So for sustaining and improving predictable issues, we're so crazed. There's a lot of focusing on the urgent that we have to focus on, but the necessity of doing that distracts us from the ability to improve. So we're not able to debrief, and we're not able to therefore continue to improve. So we suggested trying to implement quick structured debriefs to assess and improve. So I come from the world of surgical safety checklists as part of my background research, and we try to do each pause point in the surgery, including that debrief, was designed to be less than a minute. So and building that into the cadence of the team can be incredibly important, but that moment for reflection is critical. Major stress and anxiety eclipses other learning is another problem. So creating structures for managing that stress, we talked about a few of them, but in particular, we've seen, and I think people are recommending, this redeployment of people with specific roles like social work or psychiatry out to the teams in order to help those trying to deliver direct patient care or other frontline worker positions, so that people are there and can see and observe and call attention early. And then last, changing personnel across shifts, undermining the ability to transfer learning. So this requires, in some instances, centralized systems that highlight and communicate issues and key metrics over time, so people can kind of have a sense of where we are and what's going on. as teams are moving and shifting and changing and the rest. And I think, we've seen within Stanford these kinds of centralized systems emerging. What I see less of is central systems that are highlighting how are our teams doing, how are people doing. Using, one way of doing it is using simple pulse or temperature check kinds of measures. So I recommended to an organization in Massachusetts where I sit on the board, and they instituted these pulse measures, and they would just, it was a signal to people that we care about you, and it was the input from people gave them the ability to say, yep, they're about where I think they were, or, oh, I didn't realize that they're still doing a lot worse than I expected, or that there's still huge variation in how people are doing. When I implemented it with my own, in my own teaching courses this term, I usually found, from not really doing very well to thriving, and that changed over time. So thoughts on these? I see another comment from Miriam. How do we replace the celebratory routines that improve morale, like potlucks and birthday parties in the break rooms? Well, that is such a great question. I'll share, this is outside the context of the work environment, but I had last night, a memorial service for my aunt, where we brought everybody together on Zoom, and we used the gallery mode. It was quite impressive how much I felt like we could connect. So I saw that message, and it just came to mind, but others may have suggestions. Trisha writes, my department did a virtual summer bingo. Oh, excellent. Over 2 days, people reached out through a variety of means to ask others, do you have an avocado tree? Do you love yoga? The group loved it. Someone had solicited the fun facts ahead of time. Terrific, wonderful. In the department that Alan and I participate in, they also did a group activity where we all sent in our baby pictures. We had to guess who each other was. That was pretty fun. So any other quick thoughts? Or not so quick thoughts? I'd love. Well, again, I would suggest keep thinking creatively about how to do these things, and looking for the problem, looking for what we know are likely to be problems, and thinking about new and different ways that build on the recommendations from the literature, but we acknowledge are going to require kind of different approaches to addressing here. So I wanted to talk, in talking about those 4 different areas, I talked about sort of the role that leaders play in doing those things, and it's absolutely true. But there's also this instance of we're in this acute crisis situation, as I think it was Anne who mentioned early on, when it's really important to take charge. And this was just, this came out yesterday, I believe, or I saw it yesterday in an article about from Stanford Magazine. It was talking about alums, but alums who are very actively engaged in dealing with what's going on in COVID. And specifically, the article focused on the decision for the Bay Area to shelter in place. And so just want to point out a couple of things, because I think there are important lessons to take from it. So Sarah Cody's reflecting on, Sarah Cody, public health officer in Santa Clara County, was the first to implement the shelter in place requirements in Santa Clara. She said, in reflecting on this, she says, I remember there was a lot of discussion of, you guys are moving too fast. This is impossible. We can never get this done. Let's stop and think about this and do it and do this right. I remember looking at some basic models of exponential spread and thinking, we actually don't have that time. We just need to move. Eventually, everyone did get on board. So she's reflecting on, the natural tendency is to want to slow down, get more information, figure out where we're going to go. And she said, we just didn't have the time. And then George Rutherford, who's at UCSF, an epidemiologist and biostatistician, says, could have been a disaster here, but it wasn't. And I think the reason it wasn't was the 7 health officers and mayors and boards of supervisors. So the ability to build a team. So here, this is obviously different than the frontline COVID teams that we've been talking about, but I just thought it was such a great example of the kind of leadership that that sometimes we need when outside of kind of managing the structuring and the launching and the facilitating and the sustaining, we just need to take charge. So I throw this out from another recent article by colleagues talking about what it takes to lead teams effectively in crisis, and this need to overcome what we would typically do. So on the left, what's instinctive when we're facing uncertainty. For example, like we want to wait for additional information, and what instead you need to do is act with urgency. What you would tend to do is to downplay the threat and withhold bad news, and unfortunately we've seen leaders doing that. But instead, what you need to do is communicate with total transparency in order to give people the trust in the decision making that's going on. And we did see that in Santa Clara. I think the other person people like to call out is the Prime Minister in New Zealand, who really got COVID under control, doubling down to explain your actions more clearly rather than taking responsibility and focusing on solving the problem. And then we like to see the staying the course. And in fact, that's absolutely the wrong thing to do in this situation. And instead, you need to engage in constant updating. So this package of ideas around leadership are: you act, you're transparent about why you're acting in the way that you're acting, you take responsibility for having acted this way, and you focus on solving problems. And through the solving problems, you continually learn, and through that learning, you update your decisions and your actions, and you say from the beginning that this is the way we're going to need to proceed because we just don't have the information that we need, and yet we need to move ahead. And I use the example of the public health officers in Santa Clara or in the Bay Area because it was such a good example. But I think that this same kind of leadership can be also required in the sorts of teams that people are leading on the front lines all the time. So I wanted to also introduce you to these aspects of leadership, and you're welcome to comment on that as well. But I will, given the shortness of time, let me just summarize to say that what we talked about was COVID-19 representing an unprecedented context for the teams that we're trying to create, and that we've got recommendations from the research about strategies that will help us overcome these predictable problems. So we should be drawing on that and building on that, recognizing that the context is really uncertain and fast-paced and everything else that makes it super difficult. Making teams effective during COVID requires attention to all of those vital stages of teamwork: the structuring, the launching, the facilitating, and the sustaining and improving, as well as sometimes acting with urgency despite the uncertainty, and then the willingness to, and the humility again, to continue to update, as well as to be transparent and communicate about that throughout. Our urgency may, so the good news, I guess, is that this urgency may inspire unprecedented collaboration, and I think people have talked about that and have experienced it. And if you have, I'd love to hear your story. And we hope that leveraging insights from existing teamwork research can accelerate the ability of teams to reach that stage. So I will stop here and say thank you and take any questions. I know we just have a little bit of time, but thank you for your input on this too. Anybody have comments, questions?
Well, Sarah, this is Mike Whitty. Thank you very much for this, and CHCF as well. And I hope you do it again, because it feels like this is what we're dealing with is a moving target, and it'd be really helpful to see how we're all coping and how we're maybe having to find unexpected ways to be able to develop teams and successes, moving forward. So, love to check in again sometime.
I would love to check in again too. And I'm wondering, so, we wrote this paper, it's been a month or so now. And I'm curious, like, does it still feel like the right advice given where you're at with your teams. Oh, and you're supposed to fill out the evaluation. Thank you for posting that, Gina.
Hey, Sarah, this is Tori Start. Yeah, I think your information is still very timely. I mean, this really is a marathon, and our teams are still just adjusting. And what I'm seeing is the fatigue factor, right? How do we create resiliency and support them over time? And I think everything that you put out there will be something we can use as we move forward. So I think it's really helpful and still very pertinent.
That's great. I do think, you know, to Mike's point, I think this sort of, you know, we also as researchers in our observation of what's going on, a lot of what we put out there were kind of best guesses based on lots of research and what we were hearing. But we are also in that kind of humble inquiry, constantly updating our best guesses type of mode. So we're very eager to continue to learn as organizations evolve. You know, I don't wish a kind of new surge, but I think that's going to shake things up again in terms of how people are working together. I hope that what we'll see at that stage in the places where it occurs is deep learning from the first time through that is going to enable us to demonstrate that we have learned to cope better. And I think that there's going to be a huge opportunity to learn how to learn. And this is going to be a unique natural experiment where the need to have learned is going to be so evident that it will be fascinating to see who does it well.
I think anything that you can look at around resiliency and being able to renew and rejuvenate the teams is going to be really helpful, because most people don't know how to run a marathon, nor would ever want to run a marathon. And so, you know, how do you actually train for something that you don't want to do, but you have to do it?
Mm-hmm. Great. I agree. It's tough. It's really, really tough to sustain people's attention when they experience stress over the long term, and kind of the ability to kind of continue to bring it to the work every day. So building that resiliency as individuals, as teams, and as organizations, I think is critical. I agree.